I'm here at the Institute of International Education, and we're delighted to once again welcome the National Committee, and particularly today for this speaker, because who Margot will introduce, so I'm not going to introduce you, but particularly today because IIE has worked also in China for many years with NGOs, and also probably most notably with the Fulbright program, which IIE administers on behalf of the Department of State and through our office in Beijing. And we've any of you who have go to Beijing and haven't visited our office, I invite you to do so. We are also, I'm just going to throw it out there, going to be looking for a new director for our office in Beijing, since the long-standing Keith Clemenger, who's been here forever working for all of us, has taken another job in China, starting in starting in October. He promises he won't leave till he gives us a new director, but if any of you know a wonderful person who wants to run our office in Beijing, you can just hand his resume. Anyway, let me turn it over to Margot and introduce Shawn more properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you to IIE for welcoming the National Committee, and Shawn Shieh to our program today. Thank you all for coming. We're delighted by this turnout. As you know, I think, from our invitation and the materials we sent out, the impetus for this program is the publication of two items: the Chinese NGO Directory, which is in English and in Chinese. It's a tremendous resource, so if you haven't already looked at it and you haven't already decided to buy it, please, we have copies out in the anteroom, and I urge you to do so. Also, the Diversification of Public Advocacy in China, another publication of the China Development Brief that is very much worth your attention. You have Shawn's bio, so I will not repeat it or read it to you. I will say, though, that I asked him yesterday when we were talking why he decided to leave academia. He was a professor at Marist College up the Hudson River a bit in Poughkeepsie, to move to China and start. He didn't immediately start working on the China Development Brief, but eventually he did. And he looked at me as though this was a very curious question and said, well, I thought maybe I could do something useful. So now you will hear how Shawn is doing something useful. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Margot. And of course, no, really, it was because of the money. Because we all know that the nonprofit sector, you can just make, that's where the big bucks are made. So I do want to say, though, that, the reason I'm here is to talk about these two publications and to promote it. And I want to let people know that if you do buy the directory or the advocacy report, that the money will go to good use. It will go to paying our electricity bills, our printing costs, and all the good things that are required to keep our office going. So today, I think I was here two summers ago, and I spoke about philanthropy and civil society in China, the rise of private foundations, that's been a continuing trend and an important trend, and it's one aspect of the civil society sector is the rise of foundations in China, and the hope is that those foundations will go on to support the NGOs like the ones that are in this directory. So today I want to kind of fill in other parts of the picture of the civil society sector, and those, the other aspects are grassroots NGOs, which would be the recipients of foundation money, and also public advocacy. I guess before I talk about that, let me just say something about the staff that produced it. And I do want to give credit to, especially to the Chinese staff, because they're the ones who really spent most of the time doing the research for, at least for the public advocacy report. I think the English language staff did put most of the work into the Chinese NGO Directory. We kind of had a division of labor. But the China Development Brief has been around for, at least the Chinese side, has been around for over 10 years. And they are really, very, very dedicated and experienced, knowledgeable reporters of the civil society scene in China. So I feel really honored to be working with them. I'm not sure if this pointer works, but this is, Fu Tao was one of the original founders of China Development Brief, and then he's now in Chengdu as like our special researcher. Guang Kuo is an administrator. Geng Rei is another longtime member. He's like the managing director. And these, Hai Ying and Guo Ting are both, Hai Ying is now the new editor, and Guo Ting is the staff writer. So, these are the people who, again, a very small staff that do this kind of research. And again, their contacts with NGOs is, I think, almost unparalleled. In China, they just have been doing this for so long. This is a shot of the office that we work in. We work in a courtyard office near the center of the city in Beijing, near Jingshan Park, if anybody's familiar with Beijing. It's a nice place in the summer. It's a little bit brutal in the wintertime. But here you can see, we have some bamboo and some vines, trying to make it a little bit green. But this is our rustic offices. And if you do come to Beijing, please, let us know, and you're welcome to come and pay us a visit. We also have something called the Civil Society Learning Space that we started to sort of bring groups of students and other people who want to learn about civil society through our space, and we give them talks about civil society sector in China. So like I said, I wanted to talk about the whole different aspects of the civil society sector. And the two reports that we did, the NGO Directory and the Public Advocacy report, both fill in just different aspects of the civil society sector in China. So it's part of this sort of ongoing mapping that we're doing of civil society in China. And this is kind of my attempt to sort of provide some visual of what that sector looks like. This is more suggestive than anything else. I don't mean for all these circles to be separate, but I think when I think of the civil society sector, I don't just think about NGOs. I think about other individuals or other groups that are interested in addressing social issues, public issues in China. And so those include journalists, like Dai Qing, who is both a journalist and environmentalist, lawyers, and I think maybe many of you know who this person is, academics like Yu Jianrong, and I'll talk about one of his microblogging projects later, celebrities like Jet Li, the founder of the One Foundation, artists like Ai Weiwei, and even government officials acting as individuals, and this is Wang Zhenyao, who is a good example of that. He left the Ministry of Civil Affairs to go work at the China Philanthropy Institute at Beijing Normal University to try and promote the philanthropy field. So these are all parts of that civil society sector. Some of these people, and then aside from these different groups, there's also individual citizens themselves, volunteers that are working to address, to make, I think, to address these kinds of public issues and make China a better place. Some of these people work in isolation. Some of these people and groups work in isolation. Others work in collaboration with other groups. So again, I don't mean this is more suggestive. There might be more overlap between some of these groups than you might see in this picture. So let me just start, first of all, by talking about grassroots NGOs and the findings from our NGO directory, because this NGO directory really is just a directory of grassroots NGOs. In fact, it's the first public directory of grassroots NGOs. So you go back to the first directories, and I have some of them on my shelf. Like one of the directories I have on my shelf is a directory of women's NGOs in China. It was published, I think, in 1998, so a couple years after the Fourth World Women's Conference held in Beijing. If you look through that directory, it's really interesting. Almost all the groups in that directory are women's federations. So provincial level, local level, national level women's federations. And as many of you know, women's federations are what we call mass organizations that were created by the party, or what maybe some people would call gongos, right? Government-organized NGOs. So it was interesting to see that and to compare it with this directory, because in 1998 there were no grassroots NGOs, and now there are enough that we can actually make a whole directory of them. Well, let me just kind of move on about this. Let me just talk a little bit about why we made this directory. And there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one reason, like I said, was to raise awareness about and attract support for China's grassroots public benefit NGOs. Like I said, previous directories really did not make a distinction between gongos and grassroots NGOs. And this is true even of previous directories that were made by China Development Brief. So this is really the first public directory of Chinese grassroots NGOs. By grassroots, I'm talking about groups or organizations that are created from the bottom up. They were created by citizens with no ties to the government. And they differ from gongos, which are top-down NGOs with some kind of government background. And like many other parts of China's civil society, these grassroots NGOs are private, voluntary, self-governing, nonprofit, and mission-driven. So they come close to sort of the international standard of civil society, and these are some of the characteristics of what we associate with civil society internationally. So this is why we focused on this group, just to make it clear who these NGOs are. In terms of how we made this directory, well, this is a year-long project it took us a year to basically get all the information about these NGOs together and get their profiles and to translate them, because both into Chinese and into English. So what we did was we started with a list of NGOs that we had reported on. China Development Brief had been reporting for the last 10 years on all these NGOs. Then we also asked, we had 9 regional partners we worked with, to ask them to identify and give us a list of other NGOs working in their region. In order to make it into this directory, they had to meet several criteria. They had to be grassroots, they had to be public interest groups, they had to be groups working in like environment, gender, migrant labor, legal aid, disabilities, community development. They had to be established for 2 years, so this directory doesn't contain any NGOs that were established, I think, in 2012 and 2013. They had to be active. They had to have ongoing projects, ongoing programs, and they had to be recognized by others, by our regional partners. So, basically, I think what you have in this directory are the better known, more established grassroots NGOs in China, and that's really what we were aiming for. We were fortunate to get 251. I think we had a list of over 300, but there were like 50 or so NGOs that we couldn't get information from because for some reason or another we called them or we sent them emails and they just never responded to us. And so maybe that's just an indication of the lack of capacity of these NGOs. I mean, a lot of NGOs just don't have the staff. You call the phone number and nobody answers. They're off, doing their projects. So it was a really difficult process trying to get all this information together. But we were happy that we got at least 251 because I think 250 when I hear 250 in Chinese doesn't sound good because it makes it's kind of a way of saying that you're slow or you're a little stupid. So we had to make it like something other than 250. So just to provide some context, how are these NGOs, these grassroots NGOs in this directory situated in the larger associational sphere of China's NGOs? So I tried to provide that context by just giving you this image, and you can see here that this is based on 2005 estimates. I mean, if we look at the associational sphere, a lot of the associations in China are gongos. And in 2005, it was estimated to be 6.7 million gongos. This number is really large because these gongos include both national level and local level gongos. And gongos like the Women's Federation have a national network, right? So there's a national level women's federation. Every province has a women's federation. Every county has a women's federation. Every city has a women's federation. That's why there's so many of these gongos. Then you have a much smaller group of registered NGOs. So these are NGOs that are registered with civil affairs. And in 2005, the number was 320,000. I think now it's over 450,000.
Carl, just as the legal expert, let me clarify why those are not registered NGOs. They're mass organizations. They're not required to register. So if you look at the registration regulations, you will see that certain different types of NGOs are accepted from the registration requirement, and those 6.7 million are accepted from the registration requirement.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, thanks for the clarification. And I have gongos overlapping with registered NGOs because there are, I think, a number of registered NGOs that are also gongos. And this is why it makes it so difficult to know what constitutes a grassroots NGO, because you couldn't tell just from the registration list. Then, in addition to this group, there's also a group of unregistered NGOs. So let me just explain what that means. What does it mean to be unregistered? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have no registration status. It means you're either registered as a business, or you're unregistered, or you're attached to some legal entity. I think the Chinese term is guakao. So, and this is a large group, but we don't really know how big it is because they're unregistered. It also includes community organizations. So there's many of these community organizations in urban communities that organize, singing performances, dancing performances, bridge clubs, these kinds of things. Those are included in that group. Student organizations, student clubs and universities are also included in this category. Some people estimate there could be somewhere around 1 million or more. So I just put that number in. So the NGOs in this directory, the grassroots NGOs in this directory, are represented by this little black dot here. And that's really, again, just to give you some context, this is just a small slice of the larger associational sphere. It's a black dot that would cross sort of between the registered and the unregistered NGOs. So some of these are registered, some are unregistered. And I'll talk more about that later. There's also, some people would include within the sort of NGO sphere rural associations. These are mostly small, these are technical associations that, of farmers sharing farming techniques, how to raise livestock, things like that. And there's over 1 million of those. And then some scholars would also include self-governing organizations like village committees or residence committees in urban areas. So I just put those in. So it's a pretty large number of groups, but again, what we captured in this directory is a very small slice of that. So I just want to make that clear. So we have 251 of these grassroots NGOs in here. What did we find? What we did is we went and we analyzed the data that was provided to us by these 251 NGOs because we wanted to get a sense of what kind of work they did and what their registration status was, when they were established and all of that. So again, and this was something that we put into our mapping report, which is also contained in the NGO Directory. So in terms of the regional distribution, this is what we found. And by the way, I think that the National Committee hosted Anthony Spires. And Anthony Spires did an interesting study of grassroots NGOs from 3 different provinces, Guangdong, Yunnan, Yunnan, and Beijing. And he just published something in, I think, the China Journal about that. So this is really good because this year is the first year that we had two major studies or two major samples of grassroots NGOs. I don't know of any others that exist before this year. So this year I think was kind of a really good year for grassroots NGOs. Our sampling, unlike Spire's, was national. So here's what we found, that there are certain regions where NGOs tend to be clustered. One, of course, is Beijing, with 71 of the 251. Another cluster is the coastal area along the eastern coast. So Jiangsu, Shanghai, Zhejiang, Guangdong, Fujian. Another cluster here in the southwest, Sichuan, Yunnan, Shaanxi. So I think that's where some of the major clusters are. There's not that many NGOs that we found in central China. It tends to be kind of more of an underdeveloped area for NGOs, and the northeast. You'll also notice that we weren't able to get NGOs from some of the outlying ethnic minority areas, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. And that doesn't mean that there are no grassroots NGOs there. It just means that we were not able to find any, or they did not want their information to be made public. In terms of sector distribution, here's what we found. Environment was the most common, so environmental NGOs. Then followed by education, and I guess that's not too much of a surprise given that environment and education tend not to be very sensitive areas. Disabilities was also a common sector. A number of NGOs working in that sector, also in community development, migrant workers, women, and then there were more sectors to the right, but I just didn't have room to put them all in. But I think there were others like I think legal aid, LGBT, or some of the smaller sectors. In terms of when these NGOs came about, you can see that a lot of Chinese NGOs, grassroots NGOs, are fairly new. Over 80% were established after 2000. And you can see very few were around before 2000. And this is, again, consistent with kind of our anecdotal experience, which is that, I mean, it used to be, as one scholar said to me, 10 years ago, you knew everybody in the field, you knew all the NGOs, and now it's just like, there's just so many, it's just impossible to know, and there's more and more that are coming around every day. And also, this is consistent with, I think, Spire's finding that, a lot of his NGOs, I think more than 80%, also had the same pattern, that more than 80% were established after 2000. Registration status. So this is interesting. There are two categories of legally registered NGOs. One is social associations, which are like membership associations. And then there's civil non-enterprise units, which are kind of like service provision organizations. And if you look at those two categories, you can see that constitutes over 60% of our sample. So over 60% of our sample, of our NGOs, are legally registered with civil affairs, which was a higher number than we expected. And maybe that can be explained by the fact that, again, our NGOs tend to be the more established, the larger and better known NGOs. I think Spire's, his sample contained a number of much smaller grassroots NGOs, and many of them, a larger percentage were not registered. In our sample, 25% were registered as businesses, 7.6% were not registered, and then 4.4% were other, which means they were probably attached to some other legal organization. In terms of number of staff, again, you can see most of these NGOs are very small. Most of them about 1 to 10 staff, full-time staff. one thing that was interesting was that we are beginning to see a group of NGOs that are beginning to gain a certain degree of capacity. So here you can see about 20 of the NGOs in our directory have over 30 staff. But certainly, you know, if you compare these NGOs to the international NGOs that work in China, I mean, there's no comparison. I mean, the World Wildlife Federation, in their offices in China, I think they have like over 150 staff, full-time staff in China. So, you know, we're comparing apples and oranges there. Budgets. Well, budgets are always tricky. You know, I think this many did not want to report their budgets. But if you take, okay, so of those who did report their budgets, you can see again that fairly small budgets, you know, most of them under 1 million, and this is renminbi. I think the World Wildlife Federation's budget in China is over like 15 million US dollars. So again, but again, you can see there's some organizations, some NGOs that are beginning to acquire, you know, a fairly, you know, large budget, at least relative to other Chinese NGOs. And then finally, we also asked, you know, who funded them? I mean, who were their major funders? And this is interesting because in the past, a lot of grassroots NGOs relied on international funding. So they relied on funding from international foundations and NGOs like the Ford Foundation or the Asia Foundation. And, you know, foreign governments, like embassies. And that's still the case, that many of these NGOs you can see still there were a number, you know, like over 60% said that their major funders were international foundations, and over 20% said their major funders included foreign governments. But here you can also see that that's beginning to diversify, that picture's beginning to change, that we're beginning to see more and more NGOs who also say their major funders are coming from Chinese foundations, Chinese companies, and even the Chinese government. So it was this year, right, that the central government in China established a fund for contracting services. 2012, but it started this year.
Yep.
Right? The money is actually being dispersed this year. Yeah. So, and that was a pretty significant amount of money. It was, what, 200 million renminbi.
Yes.
So.
This adds up to more than 100%. What's...
Yeah, very perceptive. No, but this is, okay, but this is, the way we did this is we asked them who their major funders were. So they could include more than one.
Okay.
Right. And, you know, so people would, I mean, some organizations would say, well, Chinese foundations, international foundations, and foreign governments, you know. So yeah, you could have more than one in that category. Okay. So that gives you, I think, you know, some idea of the NGOs in this sector. You know, they're relatively new, have kind of fairly low capacity, but they work, you know, nationally. Some NGOs, when I say they work, I mean, they're, you know, you can find them in almost every province. Some NGOs, something I didn't put up here is that some NGOs, you can see some NGOs do work nationally. Most NGOs had more of a regional scope or a local scope in terms of their operations. So that's just something about grassroots NGOs. And the second part I wanted to just focus on was public advocacy, and to talk about the findings in our public advocacy report, which again also was written this year. And one of the reasons we did this public advocacy report was to compare, kind of see how things had changed in the sector compared with 2006. So 2006, China Development Brief did a special report on NGO advocacy. And just as a baseline for comparison, the findings from the 2006 report were as follows. That in that 2006 report, we found that most NGOs saw themselves as kind of assistants or collaborators with the government and with business sector rather than critics. Very few NGOs expressed any concern about the business sector, the private sector. Most NGOs, when they were asked about what advocacy meant for them, they said raising awareness. So raising awareness was identified as more important, as an important goal, twice as much as improving government policy. So there weren't that many NGOs that really thought about advocacy as trying to change policy or trying to improve policy. It's more about just kind of raising general awareness. Another finding was that few NGOs really had a carefully thought out communication strategy. So I think what we saw in this report was that the space for public advocacy in 2006 was really quite restricted. The best advocacy cases occurred in the environmental sector. So one of those cases was the case of the Nujiang Dam in 2004, where a number of environmental NGOs basically got together and got media and government attention on the decision to build dams in the New River, which is the last wild river in China in the Yunnan province. And that kind of advocacy really had an impact because I think 2004, Premier Wen Jiabao decided to shelve that dam project. So that was one of those kind of the exceptions to the rule. So what did we find from this new report in terms of what had changed? And here's what we found had changed. We found that more NGOs were adopting a more of a rights-based perspective, talking about how can we change sort of power relationships in China to address social issues and environmental issues. We found that NGOs were not just collaborating with the business sector, but were also adopting a more supervisory and advocacy-based approach towards business, seeing themselves as supervisors of business behavior. 3, we saw that more advocacy NGOs and networks have begun to emerge, and they were beginning to emphasize more public participation and policy change. 4, we found that more actors, the actors that were participating in advocacy, were becoming more diverse. So it wasn't just NGOs, it was also foundations, it was entrepreneurs, it was celebrities, it was media, it was individual citizens. And finally, we found that advocacy methods that they used were becoming more diverse. We saw the emergence of networks, social media, which just came around the last couple of years, impact litigation, performance art, petitioning, social movements. So I want to give you a sense of some of these some cases or examples of this. I just want to mention though, what makes these kinds of public advocacy, what makes this diversification possible? And I want to talk about the infrastructure for public advocacy, which we go into detail in more in our report. So a couple of things I want to point out. That one reason for more of this growth in public advocacy and diversification has to do with changes in the legal system. So a number of new laws that came about over the last 10, 15 years, calling for more open government information, being able to sue the government through the administrative, what's the name of that law? The administrative... Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you. And also, other kinds of environmental assessment impact laws. So, you're seeing that citizens and NGOs are beginning to take advantage of these laws to file lawsuits to try to change policy. Another thing is a growing awareness of citizen rights and responsibilities, and that seems to be pretty evident in this report. We're also seeing a more mature, a more networked civil society. A fourth, I think, is the growth of social media, which has become a really important tool for a number of individual activists and NGOs. And finally, the involvement of mainstream media, which kind of comes along with social media. I think a lot of mainstream media has really social media has gotten mainstream media to pay more attention to a number of these issues. So let me just give you one case study. One case of this kind of diversification of public advocacy is the emergence of NGO advocacy networks like the Green Choice Alliance. The Green Choice Alliance was started in 2007 by the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, which was founded by Ma Jun. And it's an alliance of over 20 environmental NGOs nationwide. And basically what they do is they monitor pollution by businesses, by enterprises. And they do that by relying on government data on what kinds of enterprises violate emission standards. And then they report that. They put these enterprises on a blacklist. And the enterprises are required to show that they've improved their behavior, their performance, to be removed from that list. They've also done some reports. So a couple of these reports, like one on monitoring heavy metal pollution in the IT industry. And this one also got a lot of attention because it involved Apple and Apple's supply chain. So this is the other side of Apple II. It's about how pollution spreads through Apple's supply chain. And again, it was done, here's by five, the report was done by five of these environmental NGOs. So that was something that got, a lot of attention. I think, Apple's, the labor practices, the environmental practices in Apple's supply chain got a lot of media attention over the last couple of years. Another case is, the use of social media. So there's, they use this term like micro public interest, like 微公益 actions, like using social media to sort of get the attention of the public and get the public involved in social issues. So this is a case that was started by Yu Jianrong, who was an academic at the Academy of Social Sciences. And he used microblogging to basically identify children who, sort of child trafficking, and getting people to take pictures of children that they thought were being involved in trafficking, who were being used as beggars. So this is just one case of that. Another case is something that was started by Feng Yongfeng, and he's a journalist, and he's also the founder of the Green Beagle Environmental Institute and Nature University. So he started this campaign called "I Will Test the Air Quality for the Homeland," very kind of patriotic-sounding campaign in 2011, and they basically latched onto the U.S. Embassy's air quality monitoring index, where they use PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 are the small particulates that seem to be more damaging to your lungs. But the Chinese government was not using PM 2.5 in its air quality monitors. So when people began to realize that there was this discrepancy between the U.S. Embassy's monitor and the Chinese government's, they began to go on microblogs, the Weibo, and talk about this. And Feng Yongfeng kind of latched onto this, and he used microblogs as a way to get people's attention about the PM 2.5 issue. He used microblogs to fundraise and to buy these monitors, handheld monitors that you distribute to volunteers around the country, and they would go around and monitor and measure the air quality and put those results up through microblog. And so by doing this, it really got a lot of public attention on this issue. Feng Yongfeng was not the only one. There were other people, other well-known sort of celebrities, who also went online to sort of spread awareness of this. And I think it did have some impact on the Chinese government's decision in 2012 to finally adopt PM 2.5 into its air quality indicator. Impact litigation. So, one case of this was 2009, the Deng Yujiao case, which highlighted the issue of sexual harassment. So Deng Yujiao was being sexually assaulted by a local official, and she tried to defend herself and ended up stabbing and killing the local official, and she got a very harsh prison sentence. And when that was made when people were made aware of that, a lot of people went on social media to criticize the sentence, and later on her sentence was reduced. But it was a case that really highlighted the issue of sexual harassment in China. So this is one particular case that I highlighted. Another one that we highlighted in the reports was about sort of using both litigation and performance art to raise awareness of hepatitis B discrimination. This is a picture of a guy sitting on a toilet saying, please don't let the regulations that basically prohibit discriminating on the basis of hepatitis B to be used as toilet paper. These regulations should really be enforced. They should have some real sticking power, not just be toilet paper. So that was another case. Here's a case about raising awareness about AIDS discrimination and asking high-profile people to hold up signs about AIDS discrimination. So this is Gary Locke, who's the ambassador to the U.S. And he's holding up a sign saying that those infected with HIV/AIDS in American organizations enjoy equal access to employment. That again, in the U.S. U.S. government agencies don't discriminate if you have AIDS, and this is again to highlight this whole issue of AIDS discrimination, employment discrimination that was occurring in China. Another sort of example of performance art here was a walk for the rights of women workers that was it's organized by a Shenzhen NGO called Hand in Hand, Shou Qian Shou. And so this is a labor organization in Shenzhen, and they organized basically the male workers to walk through a park, and you can see that they're all wearing red high-heeled shoes. So the whole idea was just basically highlight the plight of women workers, and they would walk through the park yelling things like end sexual harassment and domestic violence and things like that. So that was an interesting case, especially because in China it is difficult to organize, to assemble groups of people to address these kinds of issues. So they were just saying, I guess they were just taking a walk through the park. New social movements are another case. So all these environmental protests that are occurring, I mean, especially the ones last year, there were 3 or 4 environmental protests that occurred. This is just one of them in Qidong in Jiangsu province. So again, showing that a greater awareness among Chinese about their environmental rights. And then finally, some more cases of performance art done by some enterprising young people. So here's a Henan student who was taking the exam, and she's sending pears to the Jiaoyubu, to the Ministry of Education. Does anybody know why she would be sending pears? It's like Song Yali to 恳请部长跟压力. So it's just a play on, it's a kind of play on Chinese, it's a pun on Chinese words. So yali is the pear, it's the name of the pear, but yali is the Chinese word for pressure. So it's a kind of a way to sort of put pressure on local officials and asking the Ministry of Education to put pressure on local officials to basically address the inequality in the college entrance exam. That in Henan province, you have to get a higher score to get into the same college as a Beijing student. So this is just another example of performance art. Here's another guy. And I just took some of these slides I took from the person who was actually engaged in doing this performance art. And so he had put this in Chinese down here, and I just translated it into English. But another person sending pears to some local government office. The guy who did this presentation his name is Lei Chuang, and he was this guy's done a lot of performance art throughout China, and this is one of the things that he did. It's called, he said, I'm a hepatitis B, I'm infected with hepatitis B, and I wanted to invite the premier to dinner. 我要请那个总理吃饭. And so he said, he says, as a university graduate, one of the few things that he can do is write letters. He's good at writing letters. So when he first wrote his letter, he said he shaved his head. And then in this picture, you can see he's written 38 letters to the premier, inviting him to dinner. Here, his hair is starting to grow back. You can see that he's written 100 letters. This is in June 29th. This is October 7th. He's now written 200 letters. January 15th, he's written 300 letters. Again, he says this is the only thing he could do. He just keeps writing letters. April, 400 letters. July, 495 letters. October, 585. I think almost a year's passed. So then he gets a letter from the Central Petition Office saying, please do not send us any more letters. So what does he do? He says, the only thing I can do is just write more letters. So March he sends more. He's got up to 713. By this time, the Wen Jiabao has stepped down. But he said, having dinner is not the goal. Victory is in the process. So he continued to write letters to the new premier, Li Keqiang. All right, let me just end here by just talking about, talking about what our findings were, and that, what we're looking at is, I think, civil society and advocacy with Chinese characteristics, and promoting a harmonious society. And what do I mean by this? First of all, I think that when we talk about good governance, I think good governance requires that citizens be able to participate in public decisions to protect their interests and their rights and to hold government and business accountable. And this is what we're beginning to see in China, that we're beginning to see NGOs and advocacy beginning to play a small but growing role in ensuring that citizens are heard in an orderly manner, in promoting good governance and in promoting a harmonious society. But I think it's important to stress, and you can see this in all the cases that I talked about, that civil society activities take place still in a very limited space, in a space where you still have to be cautious about how you carry out those advocacy activities. And we can see the grassroots NGOs and other citizen advocates really have to be very careful, very thoughtful, and very strategic about the way they carry out their work, if they want to carry it out in a way that's sustainable. I always think about politics, and what they say is politics is the art of the possible. And, what you see here are people trying to, within the space possible, trying to carry out advocacy, trying to participate in public decisions through the use of personal, informal networks, by, using or monitoring enterprises using information obtained from the government, which is a safe way to do it, and targeting mostly multinational companies, which again is safer than targeting state-owned enterprises, because multinational companies, yes, they're easier targets, and multinational companies care more about their image. So it's a strategic choice. It may not be fair to target multinational companies, but for NGOs it works. Addressing issues that can be addressed. Issues like equal access to education, environmental pollution, animal rights, which has become a growing issue in China, domestic violence, sexual harassment, hepatitis B and AIDS, employment discrimination. These are the kinds of issues that NGOs and activists, find that they can work on, that they can get some kind of traction on it. And doing things like taking strolls, right, through the city or strolls through the park, again, as a way to get around the regulations about organizing and assembly in China, and using performance art, because performance art only requires that you only have one or two people. It can be done, it doesn't require that you have crowds, and it's a way to get attention, a way to get public attention, to get media attention. So, I think these are all the things that we're beginning to see from our report, and something I just want to stress, because this kind of stuff is still something that has to be done in a way that is sensitive, and to recognize that there are still constraints on the kinds of public activities that you can carry out in China. So maybe I'll stop here and just take questions.
Do you want me to call on people, or would you like to?
I'll be glad to. Yeah, Carla.
Please identify yourself.
I'm Carla Simon, and I teach at Catholic University of America, and I wrote this big book on civil society in China, which is why I keep hyping up with some stuff, because I do know some of the answers to some of these issues. Shawn, I thought that was a really good, a very good presentation, and I liked the linking of the two, and obviously Lee and I are buying both publications for the library of ICCSL. But I'm curious, going back to the first part about your study, one of the things that you know, because I blog about this, that concerns me is the lack of good governance within the civil society sector in China. And it's not just limited to the foundations, which is where all the scandals have been, but also to the grassroots NGOs. You didn't look at all at board structure, I gather. I'm curious why not. In other words, to me, and just so everybody understands, one of the problems is that we base our governance of NGOs on our system, which basically has independent directors. Mm-hmm. And in China, in fact, for the foundations, there's a requirement that you have a two-tiered board governance structure, which is a board and a supervisory board, which tends to create better governance. But with respect to the NGOs, there's absolutely nothing in the regulations about governance. Mm-hmm. So you have a bunch of NGOs that essentially use their staff as if they were directors, and they don't have independent people sitting there making sure that they have good governance. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious why you didn't address that question.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and it's something that
we can do another study.
I think NGOs, based a lot. Yeah, we could do right. We could do another study of that. There are some things in the regulations that require them to have bylaws, and require them to do reporting and stuff like that. But the board of directors. I think we had an interesting discussion about this. I forget on one of the listservs or something like that. Where
yes, we did.
Some people said, well, in China you have a different way of doing things, and so maybe a board of directors isn't something that's necessarily suitable for Chinese NGOs. Now, I work for a Chinese NGO. I work in a Chinese NGO, and I would say, a lot of NGOs. I guess even if we gathered data on it, I don't know how much that would tell us, because NGOs could say, we have a board, but how good, how effective is the board? Do they meet? These are, I guess, that's something that would have to go into more detailed survey of these organizations. And then, when they do meet, do they actually listen to their board? But I think it's a really important, question for NGOs in terms of sustainability, because, a lot of these NGOs were started by some kind of charismatic individual. And usually, the question is, what happens if that charismatic individual decides to step down or dies? What happens? Who selects the next generation? And that's been a big issue for a lot of NGOs. So, I think a lot of Chinese NGOs could really, it would benefit them to have some kind of independent oversight over their governance. Yes.
Martin Rickman, Columbian CUNY. Shawn, my question is similar to Carla's, but slightly different. What are the incentives for Chinese people who support these foundations or these NGOs? And I'm thinking here of the fact that there are these rumors that a lot of wealthy people are still getting citizenship abroad and putting a lot of money abroad. So, given this kind of situation, plus the question of restrictions, what do you see as incentives for people to be supporting these NGOs, aside from, let's say, some charismatic people who have their own, perhaps, personal,
Yeah, right. So are you talking about, like, without regard to whether they're international funders or Chinese funders?
Chinese funders.
Are you talking about Chinese funders?
Right, not international funders, Chinese funders.
Okay, all right. I mean, what reason? I mean, it depends, again, it depends on the foundation or the funder. I think certainly for companies, for corporate foundations, it's thinking about their brand, their image. I mean,
For example, are there tax incentives like in the United States at all?
Oh yeah. There are those too. Yeah, right. But but it really depends. I mean, that whether they get tax incentives or not depends on the kinds of legal status of the NGOs that they they fund. So that's something that's a consideration. But yeah, but there's also a lot of Chinese funders that they'll again, they tend to fund projects or NGOs that work in safe areas, and I mean that's our understanding is that it's usually difficult. It's been difficult for NGOs working in more sensitive areas to get funding from Chinese foundations, and Chinese companies as well. But there are certainly tax incentives for Chinese funders to, for example, start to give a big donation to start a foundation, because then, I mean, what is it? Up to, I think it's like 12 or 13% of their
No,
income.
if it's a corporate foundation, then it's 12%.
It's 12%.
If
right?
it's an individual,
Right.
So like Narada was established by corporate funds, so that
Right.
the company could get a 12% deduction. But if it's an individual like Jet Li, who established the one foundation, it's 30%.
Right. So
And that's a really, really nice incentive.
yeah. So that would be but that's just to start the foundation. But that's not answering the question about why did they give to NGOs. And a lot of these individuals start a foundation and then they use that foundation to carry out projects, but they don't necessarily fund other NGOs. And this has been a big issue. It's like it would be nice that if these foundations had this idea about grant making to try to support other NGOs. And as an NGO that has been trying to get Chinese funding, it's not been an easy process. I can tell you. I mean, I think there's a kind of cultural gap between a lot of these corporate foundations. They come from the business world and Chinese NGOs, and it's taking time to sort of get to know one another. I mean, for both foundations and for NGOs. So I think it's not been an easy process and not easy to get support from Chinese funders.
I think we have time for one more question.
Oh, okay. Well, yes.
I'm glad I got my hand up and gave it up too quick.
And who are you?
I'm Susan Wells from Georgetown. Thank you. And I have a little organization at Georgetown Law Center called Law Asia. So come down and play with us, anybody.
Okay.
I'm thinking to myself, what is it that makes this different from this? I think this thing, Chinese characteristics, is very difficult to cope with, because what does that mean?
Yeah.
It can just be used as an excuse to mean something that's just not rule of law based, or it can be too vague to be useful.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, do you ever get any glimpse of what that? And also, as a follow-on, have you compared Taiwan foundations and that terrific religious one, which has more money set aside for health, really, than almost any other foundation in the world?
You want the Tzu Chi Foundation,
Yeah,
right?
Tzu Chi.
Yeah, right. Yeah, which is also they have offices in China as well.
Yes, I've met people, but it's kind of
Right.
people from Taiwan come and do that. The ones I've met seem to be, they began in Taiwan, but I don't know.
Right. Well, I mean, let me just say that I don't always like this word, with Chinese characteristics either. I mean, And I'm not using it. I don't use it to I don't know, excuse or to justify what they're doing. I think I'm using it to sort of explain that, again, there are sort of different. The political and the regulatory environment is very different than, let's say, in this country, and so that they have to that the kind of behavior that NGOs engage in is done in that specific environment, and it's it's behavior that not only Chinese NGOs but a lot of organizations, international NGOs, also engage in as well. So maybe it's not correct to say it's with Chinese characteristics. I'm just saying that we're talking about a very different environment here. And it just happens to be China's, and and the Chinese do like to talk about Chinese conditions. Okay, these are the Chinese conditions that we need to work in, and that people have to understand. So I wanted just to make that clear that this was a very different environment, and it's just that these are the calculations and considerations that the NGOs, both international and Chinese NGOs, have to engage in. Both of them have to be very careful about how they carry out their work, and especially, and probably even more so, international NGOs, because international NGOs, for the most part, are not registered. They have no legal, most of them have no legal status in China. So they tend to be even more cautious than the Chinese NGOs.
We are actually over time. Lest we abuse the hospitality of IIE, I need to call this to a close. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Shawn. And maybe he'll take some questions informally.
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe I spoke too long.